When Jackson Miller's old plow unearthed a strange metallic artifact glowing with impossible symbols beneath his struggling farmland, he never imagined NASA scientists would descend on his property within 48 hours, or that his discovery would contain extraterrestrial technology that hadn't been seen on Earth for thousands of years. What happened next would not only rescue his family's century-old farm from foreclosure, but uncover ancient knowledge that would revolutionize our understanding of humanity's earliest connection to the stars. Before we dive deeper into this extraordinary story, tell us where you're watching from, and if you're as fascinated by ancient mysteries as I am, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've uncovered a discovery in the Amazon that archaeologists are still trying to explain. The early spring sunrise cast long shadows across Oakridge County's rolling farmland as Jackson Miller inspected the aging plow attached to his tractor. At 43, the deep lines etched around his eyes told the story of 15-hour workdays and sleepless nights of a man who had stubbornly chosen to maintain his family's agricultural legacy when everyone, from bank loan officers to agricultural consultants, told him small farms couldn't survive in today's economy. "Just need to get through one more season," he muttered, tightening a loose bolt on the plow blade. His calloused hands worked methodically, feeling every nick and groove in the metal. "That's all I'm asking for." The morning air carried the scent of fresh soil and lingering frost, a familiar comfort in a world that seemed increasingly determined to push people like Jackson into extinction. He paused to survey his land, 180 acres that had been in the Miller family for a century, now reduced to barely 80 acres of viable production after he'd been forced to sell portions to keep the operation afloat. The changing climate patterns had devastated small farms across Oakridge County, where predictable growing seasons had once allowed family operations to thrive. Now erratic weather swings and increasingly extreme conditions meant only industrial-scale operations with expensive technology and massive capital reserves could effectively adapt. Record-breaking drought, followed by unseasonable flooding, had created a perfect storm of agricultural chaos. Once thriving family farms had been selling to agri-core industries at an alarming rate, their multi-generational legacies converted to automated corporate-owned production zones virtually overnight. They call it agricultural optimization, Jackson's neighbor Sam Collins had said last week over coffee at the local diner. But all I see is families losing everything their grandparents built. Sam's own farm was teetering on the edge, like most in the county. Jackson's pickup truck, its faded green paint now rusted along the wheel wells, sat beside the barn his grandfather had built by hand in 1939. The wooden beams had weathered nearly a century of seasons, but still stood strong, unlike the financial foundation of the operation itself. The hand-painted wooden sign reading Miller Family Farm, Esther 1923, still hung proudly at the property entrance, even as neighboring farms replaced similar signs with Agricor's sleek metal placards featuring their distinctive hexagonal logo and slogan, "Feeding Tomorrow Today." Inside his farmhouse kitchen the previous evening, Jackson had spread his financial records across the oak table, while the radio announced another small farm acquisition. His bank statement showed a balance of $7,123.16, barely enough for seed and essential equipment maintenance, with nothing left for the technological upgrades that might actually make the farm competitive again. The mortgage payment reminder sat unopened beside his coffee cup, its official envelope a harbinger of stress he couldn't bear to face just yet. 3 years ago, before the weather patterns shifted, he'd been debt-free with 120 acres in active production. The Miller farm had been known for quality organic produce, supplying restaurants and farmers' markets throughout the region, modest but sustainable until everything changed. Jackson's daughter Lily, now 17, had once talked excitedly about studying agricultural science and eventually taking over the farm. These days, she rarely mentioned the future at all. And now for our top agricultural story. The radio announcer had said with artificial cheer, Agricor Industries announced the acquisition of the Tompkins farm today, the 12th family operation purchased by the corporation this quarter. Agricor spokesperson Elizabeth Chen stated that all operations will transition to their proprietary climate-adaptive farming protocols within 60 days. Jackson had switched off the radio, his jaw tightening. Dave Tompkins was a third-generation farmer whose family had worked adjacent land since the 1930s. The Tompkins and Millers had shared equipment, knowledge, and Sunday barbecues for decades. Just last summer, Dave had stood in this very kitchen, swearing he'd never sell to those corporate vultures. If the Tompkins couldn't make it work, what chance did anyone have? Dad? Lily had appeared in the doorway, her expression a mixture of concern and resignation that no teenager should have to wear. Is everything okay? Sure thing, sweetheart, Jackson had replied automatically, quickly gathering the financial papers into a disorganized pile. Just planning for spring planting. Lily hadn't believed him. She was too smart for that, but she'd nodded anyway. Ms. Peterson posted those agricultural scholarship applications today. She thinks I have a shot. Jackson had forced a smile. College would cost money they didn't have, but he'd die before telling her not to dream. That's great. You make an amazing ag scientist. After Lily had gone to bed, Jackson returned to his grandfather's study, a small room he'd been gradually clearing out since the old man's passing 8 months ago. Harold Miller had been a quiet, methodical man who'd farmed these lands for over 60 years. The land speaks, he used to tell Jackson. Most folks just forgot how to listen. The answer to the farm's survival might lie in the curious old map Jackson had found last month while sorting through his grandfather's possessions. Hidden in a false bottom of an antique desk drawer was a weathered leather journal containing what appeared to be astronomical observations, strange calculations, and a detailed survey of the Miller property with peculiar markings, including one specific location circled in red ink and labeled only with a symbol resembling a star with 8 points. The journal entries dated back to 1947, the year his grandfather had returned from military service and taken over the farm from his own father. Some pages contained diagrams of constellations, others held complex mathematical formulas that meant nothing to Jackson. Interspersed were cryptic notes. Connection confirmed at the convergence point, and the return will come when the alignment is complete. Jackson had initially dismissed it as an old man's eccentric hobby, but desperation had a way of opening minds to unlikely possibilities. With the spring planting deadline approaching and the farm's survival hanging by a thread, Jackson had made a decision his neighbors considered further evidence of his stubborn impracticality. Instead of following modern soil analysis and planting where agricultural science dictated, he would prepare the field exactly where his grandfather's mysterious marking indicated, despite it being on a rocky ridge that conventional farming wisdom considered poor ground for cultivation. "You're wasting fuel and time, Jack," Sam had warned. When Jackson mentioned his plan, "That ridge has never yielded a decent crop in all the years I've known your family." "Maybe that's because we've been plowing it wrong," Jackson had replied, not entirely believing his own words, but clinging to the fragile hope that his grandfather's cryptic markings might hold some forgotten wisdom about the land. Now, as the early morning sun crept higher in the sky, Jackson climbed into his tractor's cab, the leather seat cracked with age, but still molded comfortably to his frame after countless hours. He unfolded his grandfather's map one last time, confirming the location marked with the 8-pointed star. With a deep breath that carried the weight of a century of family legacy, He turned the key. The engine coughed twice before rumbling to life, as if sharing his reluctance to disturb ground that had remained untouched for generations. "All right, Grandpa," he murmured, engaging the gears. "Let's see what you were hiding up there." The tractor rumbled steadily up the eastern slope of Miller Farm, bouncing over uneven terrain that hadn't been properly cultivated in decades. Jackson gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes constantly shifting between the path ahead and his grandfather's map secured to the dashboard with yellowed tape. The morning sun now hung fully above the horizon, bathing the rocky ridge in golden light that seemed to make the soil itself glow with unexpected warmth. "Nothing special about this place," Jackson muttered to himself, surveying the rocky terrain. Unlike the rich bottomland where he typically planted, this elevated section of the property featured poorer soil composition and challenging topography. Agricultural science would consider it a waste of resources, yet something about the determined way his grandfather had marked this specific location with precise coordinates and that strange eight-pointed star symbol compelled Jackson forward, despite his logical misgivings. The ridge offered a commanding view of the surrounding countryside. To the west lay the Miller farmhouse and main fields. To the east, the recently acquired Agricor properties, with their geometric precision and metal monitoring stations glinting. In the sunlight, Jackson could see 3 farms that had belonged to friends, now converted to the corporation's standardized operations, including the Tompkins place, where a crew was already dismantling the old wooden barn that had stood for generations. "Progress," Jackson scoffed, adjusting the plow depth for the rocky conditions. He positioned the tractor precisely at the spot indicated on the map, a seemingly arbitrary location halfway up the ridge where 3 large oak trees formed a rough triangle. According to the map's notations, the 8-pointed star was centered exactly 20 yards from the largest tree at a heading of 42 degrees northeast. Jackson had measured it carefully the previous evening, marking the spot with a wooden stake. That now guided his approach. After double-checking his position, Jackson engaged the hydraulics to lower the plow. The heavy steel blade bit into the earth with a resistance that immediately felt different from normal soil conditions. The tractor engine strained against unexpected opposition, a high-pitched whine joining its usual rumble. "What the hell?" Jackson muttered, easing off the throttle. He'd expected rocks. The ridge was notoriously rocky after all, but this resistance felt uniform, almost deliberate. Climbing down from the tractor cab, Jackson walked behind to examine the plow's progress. The blade had cut a clean furrow for several feet before encountering whatever now impeded its path. Kneeling in the freshly turned soil, he brushed away loose dirt with his hands, revealing what appeared to be a smooth, dark surface, unlike any rock native to Oakridge County. Some kind of old foundation, he wondered aloud, continuing to clear soil with growing curiosity. As more dirt was cleared away, Jackson realized he was looking at something far more unusual than abandoned construction. The surface had a metallic quality with a faint iridescence that shifted colors slightly when viewed from different angles. More strikingly, it was perfectly flat and smooth in a way that seemed distinctly unnatural. No concrete foundation or buried farm equipment would have this precise, almost manufactured appearance. Jackson's heart rate quickened as he retrieved a shovel from the tractor and began clearing soil more systematically. Each scoop revealed more of the strange surface, which appeared to extend in a perfect circle approximately 6 feet in diameter. Most bizarre were the markings that gradually became visible, intricate patterns of lines and symbols that resembled neither English nor any other language Jackson recognized. "What on earth did you find, Grandpa?" he whispered, tracing one of the symbols with his fingertip. The moment his skin made contact with the surface, something extraordinary happened. The symbol, A curved line intersecting with three smaller circles emitted a soft blue glow that quickly spread to adjacent markings. Within seconds, the entire exposed portion of the object was illuminated with pulsing light that seemed to emanate from within the material itself. Jackson stumbled backward, nearly falling in his haste to put distance between himself and the inexplicable phenomenon. The rational part of his mind immediately sought ordinary explanations, some kind of phosphorescence perhaps, or a trick of the morning light. But none could account for the way the symbols now appeared to shift and rearrange themselves, as if awakening after long dormancy. "This isn't possible," he muttered, reaching for his phone to document what he was seeing. As he raised the device to take photos, the glow intensified, and a low humming vibration began to emanate from the object. The sound was unlike anything Jackson had ever experienced, not mechanical exactly, but rhythmic and purposeful, almost like a form of communication. The phone in his hand suddenly grew warm, its screen flickering with interference before going completely dark. For several minutes, Jackson stood frozen, watching as more of the object's surface became animated with shifting patterns of light. His mind raced through possibilities, each more improbable than the last. A military experiment, some advanced technology accidentally buried decades ago, but nothing explained how his grandfather would have known about it, much less why he would have documented its location with astronomical calculations. After the initial shock subsided, Jackson's farming pragmatism reasserted itself. Whatever this object was, it was on Miller land, land that had been in his family for generations. If his grandfather had known about it, had deliberately preserved its location information, there must be a reason. With renewed determination, Jackson returned to his excavation efforts, working methodically to expose more of the artifact without directly touching its surface again. By midday, Jackson had cleared enough soil to reveal the object's complete circumference. It appeared to be a perfect disk, its thickness impossible to determine as it remained embedded in the earth. The glowing symbols had settled into a steady, pulsating rhythm that seemed to follow a complex pattern. Most striking was the center of the disk, where a raised design perfectly matched the 8-pointed star symbol from his grandfather's journal. Sitting back on his heels, sweat dampening his shirt despite the mild spring air, Jackson tried to make sense of his discovery. The existence of this clearly artificial object buried on the least valuable section of Miller Farm, hidden from view for decades if not longer, shattered his understanding of his family's ostensibly ordinary farming history. What was his grandfather's connection to this technology? How had he known it was here? His contemplation was interrupted by the distant sound of a vehicle coming up the farm's main drive. Rising to his feet, Jackson could see Lily's school bus, dropping her off at the end of the long gravel road that led to their house. School had ended early today, Teacher Development Day, which meant he needed to explain this inexplicable situation to his daughter sooner than he'd anticipated. Jackson glanced back at the glowing disk, then at his useless phone. Without functioning communications, he couldn't consult anyone about his discovery. Part of him wondered if he should cover it back up, pretend he'd never found it. But the farmer's instinct that had guided generations of Millers told him this discovery was important, perhaps even the answer to the farm's precarious situation, though he couldn't imagine how. Making a quick decision, Jackson grabbed a tarp from the tractor and carefully covered the exposed portion of the disc. The humming sound diminished, but didn't completely disappear, and faint blue light leaked around the tarp's edges. It would have to do for now. He secured the covering with rocks, marked the location with additional stakes, and headed down toward the house where Lily would be waiting. As he drove the tractor back down the ridge, Jackson glanced repeatedly over his shoulder at the covered site. For the first time in years, he felt something beyond the grinding worry that had become his constant companion, a spark of genuine curiosity, perhaps even hope. Whatever lay buried on that ridge, his grandfather had considered it important enough to document in secret, important enough to preserve for future generations. Now, facing the imminent loss of everything his family had built, Jackson had uncovered something that defied explanation, something that might change everything. What he didn't yet realize was how quickly that change would come, or how far beyond. His small farm, its ripples would extend. When Jackson reached the farmhouse, Lily was waiting on the porch, her backpack slung over one shoulder and a stack of papers clutched in her other hand. The sight of his daughter, her mother's eyes, his stubborn chin, momentarily grounded him back in the familiar reality of their daily struggles. "You're plowing the ridge?" she asked as he approached, her tone conveying the same skepticism his neighbors had expressed. "I thought you said that soil was too poor for planting." "Found something interesting up there," Jackson replied carefully, unsure how much to share about his bizarre discovery. "Some kind of artifact buried in the ground." Lily's expression shifted from skepticism to curiosity. "What, like arrowheads? Miss Grayson says this whole area was Shawnee territory before European settlement." "No, not arrowheads." Jackson ran a hand through his dirt-streaked hair, searching for words to describe what he'd found without sounding completely unhinged. "It's metal, I think, with strange markings, almost like technology of some kind." "Technology," Lily repeated, her interest now fully engaged. "Like what? How old?" "I don't know," Jackson admitted. "But I think your great-grandfather knew about it. I found it exactly where he marked on that old map, the one with the star symbol." Lily's eyes widened. She'd been fascinated by the journal since Jackson had discovered it, poring over the astronomical calculations and strange notations with the enthusiasm of youth, unhampered by adult skepticism. "The convergence point? You actually found something there?" Jackson nodded, then hesitated before adding, "It glows, Lily, and it made my phone stop working. I've covered it for now, but—" "It glows?" she interrupted, already heading for her bicycle propped against the porch railing. "We have to go back up there." "Wait," Jackson called, catching her arm gently. "Let's think about this. We don't know what it is or if it's safe. Before we do anything else, I want to check Grandpa's journal again, see if there are any hints about what he actually found up there." Lily reluctantly agreed, her excitement temporarily contained by her father's caution. Together, they entered the farmhouse, unaware that high above the earth, specialized monitoring systems had already detected the brief energy signature from the ridge and flagged it for immediate investigation. Jackson and Lily spent the evening poring over Harold Miller's journal by lamplight at the kitchen table. The old leather-bound book contained more mysteries than answers. Complex astronomical calculations, diagrams of constellations with certain stars prominently marked, and cryptic references to the visitors and guardians of the gateway. Most entries focused on specific celestial alignments, tracking patterns across decades with meticulous precision. "Listen to this entry from July 1947, Lily said, carefully turning a brittle page. "The visitors confirmed the convergence point today. The seed is planted where it will remain dormant until the proper alignment returns. I have been entrusted as its guardian, a duty that will pass through our bloodline." She looked up at her father. "Grandpa Harold wrote this the summer after he returned from World War II. Jackson rubbed his tired eyes. "July 1947. Why does that date sound significant?" "Roswell," Lily replied immediately. "The alleged UFO crash in New Mexico happened in Fida, July 1947. We covered it in Mr. Peterson's contemporary history elective last semester." "You think there's a connection?" Jackson asked skeptically. Lily shrugged. "I'm just saying it's an interesting coincidence. Great-grandpa writes about visitors and seeds. At exactly the same time, newspapers were running headlines about flying saucers in New Mexico." Jackson was about to respond when his phone suddenly buzzed to life on the table, startling them both. The device had remained unresponsive since his encounter with the artifact hours earlier. "That's weird," he muttered, picking it up cautiously. The screen displayed multiple missed call notifications and text messages, all from the past few minutes, as if the phone had just regained connection. Before he could check any of them, an incoming call from an unknown number demanded attention. "Hello?" Jackson answered hesitantly. "Is this Jackson Miller?" asked a crisp, professional female voice. "Yes, this is Jackson. Who's calling?" "Dr. Eleanor Reyes, NASA Astromaterials Research Division," the voice replied. "We've detected an unusual energy signature emanating from your property coordinates. I need to verify if you've observed any anomalous phenomena in the past 12 hours. Jackson's eyes met Lily's across the table, a silent question passing between them. After a moment's hesitation, he decided on cautious honesty. "I may have uncovered something unusual while plowing a field today," he admitted. "Some kind of metal object with strange markings. It seemed to activate when I touched it." The brief silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. "Mr. Miller," Dr. Reyes continued, her tone shifting subtly, "I need you to listen carefully. Do not approach the object again. Do not allow anyone else near it. A specialized research team is already en route to your location and will arrive by morning. For your safety and the integrity of what may be a significant scientific discovery, please maintain a minimum distance of 50 feet from the site until our arrival." "Wait a minute," Jackson interjected, parental protectiveness overriding his initial shock. "This is private property. You can't just—" "I understand your concerns," Dr. Reyes interrupted smoothly. "I assure you we'll address all property rights considerations appropriately. But the energy signature we've detected suggests technology of potentially critical importance to national security and scientific advancement. Time is of the essence." Jackson felt a familiar frustration rising, the same sentiment he experienced whenever powerful institutions made decisions affecting his farm without meaningful consultation. "And if I refuse?" Another pause. "The authorization for this investigation comes from levels that supersede standard jurisdictional constraints, Mr. Miller. However, we prefer collaborative approaches whenever possible. Our team will arrive at approximately 0700 hours. I suggest using the intervening time to secure any sensitive personal items and prepare for a temporary disruption to your normal routine." Before Jackson could protest further, Dr. Reyes added something unexpected. "You might be interested to know that your grandfather, Harold Miller, was known to our department. His name appears in several classified files from the late 1940s. With that bombshell, she ended the call, leaving Jackson staring at his phone in stunned silence. "What was that about great-grandpa?" Lily asked, having heard only one side of the conversation. "NASA is sending people here," Jackson replied, still processing the implications. "They somehow detected the artifact from space, I guess, and they claim Grandpa Harold was in classified files." Lily's eyes widened. "So I was right about the connection to Roswell." "We don't know that," Jackson cautioned, though his own skepticism was rapidly eroding. "But whatever this is, it's serious enough for NASA to dispatch a team overnight." Sleep proved elusive for both Millers that night. Jackson alternated between reviewing the journal for additional clues and standing at his bedroom window, gazing toward the ridge where he'd covered the mysterious disk. Several times he thought he saw a faint blue glow emanating from beneath the tarp, though distance made it difficult to be certain. Lily, meanwhile, had immersed herself in online research, hunting for any connections between NASA, her great-grandfathers, military service, and the events of summer 1947. The internet connection at the farmhouse, sporadic at the best of times, seemed unusually stable, allowing her to dive deeper than their rural access typically permitted. "Dad," she called just after midnight, laptop balanced on her knees in the living room. "I found something strange about Great-Grandpa's unit in the war. He served in the 509th Composite Group, the same unit that dropped the atomic bombs on Japan. But after the war, some members were apparently reassigned to something called Operation Celestial Shield, which doesn't appear in any official military records." Jackson, who'd been making yet another pot of coffee, froze. "Where did you find that information?" "A declassified memo mentioned it by accident," Lily explained. "I cross-referenced it with some military history forms. There's a whole community of people tracking these obscure post-war projects." Before they could discuss it further, the distant sound of vehicles approaching along the main road caught their attention. Jackson checked his watch. Barely 2 a.m., hours ahead of the scheduled arrival time Dr. Reyes had mentioned. Something had clearly accelerated the timeline. "Stay inside," he instructed Lily firmly, moving to the front door. Through the farmhouse windows, they watched as 3 black SUVs with government plates turned onto their long gravel driveway, followed by what appeared to be specialized equipment trucks with NASA insignia. The vehicles moved with purpose, their headlights cutting through the rural darkness with stark precision. Jackson stepped onto the porch as the lead SUV stopped in front of the house. A tall woman in her 40s emerged, her posture suggesting military training despite her civilian clothes. She approached with direct efficiency, extending her hand as she reached the bottom of the porch steps. "Mr. Miller?" "Dr. Eleanor Reyes, we spoke earlier. I apologize for the accelerated timeline, but the energy signature has intensified significantly within the past hour. We need to establish containment protocols immediately." Jackson shook her hand automatically, noting the firm grip and evaluating gaze. "You said morning. It's 2 a.m. "As I said, circumstances changed," she replied, her attention already shifting toward the ridge where the artifact lay covered. "The emission patterns suggest the object is in an accelerating activation sequence. Is that the location?" She pointed unerringly toward the site. "How could you possibly know exactly where?" Jackson began. "Quantum-shifted electromagnetic signatures are quite precise once properly calibrated," Dr. Reyes interrupted. "We've been monitoring similar patterns since 1947. Jackson's suspicion deepened. "You mentioned my grandfather was in your files. What exactly was his involvement with NASA?" "NASA didn't exist in its current form when your grandfather was involved," Dr. Reyes clarified. "His work fell under a joint military-scientific initiative that predated our organization. But this isn't the appropriate time for a history lesson. Mr. Miller, I have a team of specialists who need access to that ridge immediately." As they spoke, more personnel emerged from the vehicles, some in tactical gear carrying sophisticated-looking equipment, others in what appeared to be specialized protective suits. Lights were being unloaded and set up, transforming the normally dark farm into an illuminated operations zone, visible for miles across the flat landscape. The door opened behind Jackson, and Lily stepped onto the porch despite his earlier instruction to remain inside. "Are you here about the visitors?" she asked Dr. Reyes directly, clutching her great-grandfather's journal to her chest. Dr. Reyes's attention snapped to Lily with sudden intensity, then to the journal she held. "You have Harold Miller's field notes." The professional detachment in her voice gave way to unmistakable excitement. "We've been searching for those for decades." "They're family property," Jackson said firmly, moving slightly to position himself between Dr. Reyes and his daughter. "And before your team goes anywhere near that artifact, I want some straight answers. What exactly did my grandfather find? On this farm, what is that thing up there? And why has NASA been monitoring our property?" Dr. Reyes studied him for a long moment, clearly calculating how much to reveal. The operational activity continued around them, creating a surreal contrast to the normally peaceful farm night. Finally, she made a decision. In 1947, your grandfather was part of a specialized recovery team assigned to multiple impact sites following what the public knows as the Roswell incident, she explained, lowering her voice. What actually occurred was more complex than either the original flying saucer news reports or the subsequent weather balloon cover story. Multiple objects of non-terrestrial origin entered Earth's atmosphere. Some were recovered by military personnel, but others remained unaccounted for. Jackson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Are you saying my grandfather was involved with actual... We avoid using the term aliens in official contexts, Dr. Reyes supplied. We prefer non-terrestrial intelligence, or NTI. And yes, your grandfather was among the first human beings to make confirmed contact with representatives of an advanced civilization from beyond our solar system. As if on cue, the blue glow from the ridge suddenly intensified, becoming clearly visible even through the covering tarp. A low, pulsing hum carried across the farm, causing the NASA personnel to quicken their preparations. That's the activation. Sequence progressing to stage 2, Dr. Reyes explained, already moving toward one of the equipment trucks. We need to establish a containment perimeter immediately. Mr. Miller, that artifact isn't just some random piece of technology. According to our historical records, it's a communication node, a beacon designed to signal the return of those who left it here. Return? Lily repeated, her voice a mixture of fear and fascination. You mean they're coming back? Dr. Reyes's expression was impossible to read in the shifting light. That, Ms. Miller, is precisely what we're here to determine. Dawn broke over Miller Farm, unlike any morning in its century-long history, where normally there would be only the gentle sounds of wildlife and distant farm equipment. Now the ridge hummed with activity as NASA personnel established a sophisticated research perimeter around the artifact. Portable laboratory equipment had been assembled with military efficiency. Power generators hummed steadily, and a communications array had been established near the 3 oak trees that had once served as Harold Miller's navigational markers. Jackson and Lily, having been denied access to the site for several hours, now stood at the edge of the operational zone under the watchful eyes of security personnel. Dr. Reyes had finally relented to their presence after Jackson made it clear that his cooperation hinged on transparency. This was still Millerland, regardless of what lay beneath its soil. They've removed the tarp completely, Lily observed, squinting against the morning sun to see the now fully exposed disk. In daylight, its appearance was even more striking, a perfect circle of material, unlike any conventional metal, its surface still pulsing with an internal blue luminescence that seemed to follow complex patterns. The patterns are mathematical sequences, explained Dr. Elliot Chen, a quantum physicist who had been assigned as their liaison while Dr. Reyes coordinated the technical team. Prime numbers, Fibonacci sequences, and several patterns we haven't yet deciphered, all universal mathematical languages that transcend cultural development, designed to be recognized by any technologically advanced civilization, Lily said, demonstrating a grasp of the concept that made Dr. Chen raise an eyebrow with approval. Precisely, he confirmed. It's a communication protocol that doesn't require shared language or cultural context. Jackson, more concerned with practical implications than theoretical elegance, focused on the protective suits some team members wore as they worked directly with the artifact. Is that thing dangerous? Radiation or something? Not dangerous, in the conventional sense, Dr. Chen assured him. The protective gear is primarily a contamination prevention measure for the artifact's sake, not ours. Human biological material could potentially interfere with its operational parameters. Operational parameters, Jackson repeated skeptically. You're talking about it like it's a machine. It is a machine, Mr. Miller, Dr. Chen replied. "Perhaps the most sophisticated one on this planet. Initial analysis suggests components operating at the quantum level, materials unknown to our periodical table, and energy generation capabilities that defy our current understanding of physics. And according to your grandfather's journal, it's been here since 1947. Their conversation was interrupted as Dr. Reyes approached from the main research tent, tablet in hand, her expression suggesting significant developments. "We've completed the preliminary scan sequence," she announced without preamble. "The artifact is approximately 6 feet in diameter at the visible surface, but ground-penetrating radar indicates it extends nearly 30 feet below the surface in a perfect column. It appears to be a unified structure, rather than an assembly of components." 30 feet, Jackson repeated with disbelief. "That's not possible. How could something that size have been buried here without anyone noticing?" Dr. Reyes exchanged a glance with Dr. Chen before responding. "According to the classified files associated with your grandfather, it wasn't buried conventionally. Witnesses reported it submerged itself, almost like a drill, but without displacing soil in the usual manner. The technology involved would be several centuries beyond our current capabilities." Lily, who had been quietly absorbing every detail, suddenly connected another piece of the puzzle. "That's why the ridge never grew good crops. This thing has been affecting the surrounding soil for decades." "Very observant," Dr. Reyes acknowledged. "The artifact emits a low-level electromagnetic field that would indeed alter soil composition within approximately 20 meters of its location. Your great-grandfather likely knew this and deliberately kept this section of land uncultivated to avoid drawing attention to anomalous crop patterns." The conversation paused as activity at the artifact suddenly intensified. The blue pulsing had accelerated, and several researchers stepped back as new symbols appeared on the disk's surface. Symbols that hadn't been visible previously. "Phase 3 initiation," called out a technician monitoring equipment. "Quantum resonance increasing by a factor of 7. Temporal signature stabilizing." Dr. Reyes moved quickly back toward the site, gesturing for Jackson and Lily to follow. "This is happening faster than our models predicted. I think your presence may be accelerating the activation sequence." "Our presence?" Jackson asked, confused. "Why would we affect it?" "Genetic markers," Dr. Chen explained as they hurried toward the main research area. "If your grandfather was designated as what the historical files call a custodian, the technology may be programmed to recognize his genetic descendants as authorized users." They reached the primary monitoring station, where a team of scientists observed real-time data streaming across multiple screens. The artifact's glow had intensified to the point where it was clearly visible even in direct sunlight, its color shifting from blue toward a deeper violet. "Dr. Reyes," called one of the researchers urgently, "the artifact is generating a quantum field identical to the one recorded during the New Mexico incident. Signature matches to 99.7% certainty." Dr. Reyes turned to Jackson, her professional composure giving way to barely contained excitement. "Mr. Miller, what we're witnessing is unprecedented in the public scientific record. This artifact isn't just a communication device. It's a node in what we believe to be a vast interstellar network. The beings your grandfather encountered in 1947 left these devices at specific coordinates around the planet, entrusting selected individuals as custodians until a predetermined astronomical alignment triggered reactivation. Reactivation for what purpose?" Jackson asked, struggling to reconcile this extraordinary revelation with his understanding of his grandfather as simply a dedicated farmer. Instead of answering directly, Dr. Reyes handed him her tablet, which displayed a digitized image of what appeared to be a handwritten letter. "This was in your grandfather's classified file. He wrote it in 1989 to be delivered to his descendants if the artifact activated during his lifetime. Since that didn't occur, it remained sealed in government archives. I believe you should read it now." Jackson took the tablet with hesitant hands, Lily peering over his shoulder as they read together. "To my descendants who witnessed the awakening. If you are reading this, the Guardians have determined that Earth is ready for the next stage of contact. The artifact on our land is one of 7 placed at precise geomagnetic coordinates around the world. I was chosen as custodian because I witnessed their arrival in New Mexico and demonstrated what they called appropriate cognitive resonance to their presence. What I learned from them changed my understanding of our place in the universe. They are not conquerors or invaders, but observers and occasionally guides. They have watched Earth's development for millennia, occasionally providing subtle course corrections when our species approached existential crossroads. The artifact contains technological and scientific knowledge far beyond our current understanding. Knowledge they believe humanity will need to survive the challenges of our own making: climate disruption, resource depletion, the consequences of prioritizing short-term gain over long-term sustainability. When the 7 artifacts activate in sequence, they will establish what the Guardians called a restoration network, capable of accelerating Earth's natural healing processes and providing alternative energy and agricultural methods that work with planetary systems rather than against them. I was not chosen randomly. Our family has worked this land for generations, understanding the rhythms of nature and the importance of stewardship. The Guardians recognized this quality and entrusted us with this responsibility, to preserve their gift until the time was right for its unveiling. To whoever in our bloodline witnesses the awakening, you were born for this moment. Trust what the land has taught you. Remember that true progress works with natural systems, not against them. With hope for the future, you will help create. Harold Miller. Jackson lowered the tablet, his hand trembling slightly. The simple, direct words of his grandfather, a man he'd never known as anything but a practical farmer, carried the weight of a responsibility that spanned generations and potentially civilizations. "The activation sequence is approaching completion," Dr. Reyes said quietly. "According to our understanding of similar technologies, it will require final authentication from a genetic descendant of the designated custodian to fully initialize." "Authentication?" Jackson repeated. "What does that mean exactly?" Dr. Reyes gestured toward the artifact, where the central 8-pointed star symbol now pulsed with particular intensity. "Based on witness accounts from similar activations, it requires physical contact from the custodian's bloodline, accompanied by verbal acknowledgement of acceptance. You want me to touch that thing and... What? Say I accept? That would be the logical protocol, yes." Jackson glanced at Lily, seeing in her eyes both excitement and uncertainty that mirrored his own. He thought of his grandfather's letter, of the generations of millers who had worked this land with an understanding of stewardship that apparently extended beyond conventional farming wisdom. He thought of his own struggles to maintain that legacy against the encroachment of industrial agriculture that prioritized short-term yields over long-term sustainability. "What if I don't?" he asked Dr. Reyes. "What if I walk away from this whole situation?" "According to the historical records," she replied carefully, "the artifacts have secondary authentication protocols if the primary genetic line refuses. However, those protocols involve significantly more disruptive energy signatures that would likely draw international attention and potential military response. So basically, I either activate this thing voluntarily or it happens anyway with much bigger consequences." That's a simplification, but essentially accurate. Jackson took a deep breath, looking out over his struggling farm toward the neighboring properties where Agricor's mechanized approach was systematically extracting maximum yield with minimal concern for long-term consequences. If his grandfather's letter was accurate, the artifact contained knowledge that might offer an alternative path, not just for the Miller farm, but potentially for agricultural practices worldwide. "What do you think, Lily?" he asked his daughter, softly. "This is your inheritance too." She met his gaze with a certainty that belied her years. "Great-grandpa trusted us with this for a reason, Dad. I think we should trust him too." With a nod of resolution, Jackson turned back to Dr. Reyes. "I'll do it, but I want your guarantee that whatever knowledge or technology comes from this, it won't be locked away in some government vault. If this really is about helping Earth heal from what we've done to it, then that information belongs to everyone." Dr. Reyes hesitated before responding. "That decision exceeds my authority, Mr. Miller. I can, however, ensure that your role as custodian is officially acknowledged, which would give you certain rights regarding the artifact's applications." She paused, then added with unexpected candor, "And for what it's worth, I personally believe your grandfather was right about the Guardian's intentions. My entire career has been dedicated to understanding their technology, and everything I've learned suggests they genuinely wish to help humanity, not control or harm us." It wasn't the ironclad guarantee Jackson had hoped for, but it was an acknowledgement of his family's right to maintain some influence over whatever was about to unfold. With a nod to Dr. Reyes and a reassuring squeeze of Lily's shoulder, he stepped forward toward the glowing artifact. The assembled scientists fell silent as Jackson approached the disk, its surface now alive with swirling patterns of light that seemed to respond to his proximity. As he extended his hand toward the central eight-pointed star, the humming intensified, resonating at a frequency that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. "I am Jackson Miller," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Grandson of Harold Miller. I accept the responsibility of custodian." As his palm made contact with the star symbol, the world around him exploded into light. The moment Jackson's palm connected with the eight-pointed star, a column of violet light erupted from the artifact, shooting skyward with such intensity that satellites in orbit would later record it as visible even in daylight. The electromagnetic pulse that accompanied this energy release temporarily disabled all electronic equipment within a half-mile radius, plunging the NASA operation into momentary darkness before backup systems engaged. For Jackson, time seemed to slow and stretch. The world around him, the scientists, the equipment, even Lily's shocked expression, faded into peripheral awareness as his consciousness was flooded with information too vast and complex for ordinary perception. Images, concepts, and understanding cascaded through his mind like a river breaking through a dam, stellar cartography showing Earth's position in a network of inhabited worlds, the evolutionary history of multiple sentient species, mathematical equations describing energy generation through quantum resonance with zero-point fields, agricultural techniques that worked at the microbiological level to restore soil health, weather modification through harmonic electromagnetic fields that encouraged natural precipitation cycles. The knowledge transfer lasted only seconds in objective time, though to Jackson it felt like hours or even days of compressed experience. When the violet light finally receded and his normal perceptions returned, he found himself on his knees beside the artifact, which now glowed with a steady, pulsating rhythm rather than the erratic patterns of its activation phase. "Dad!" Lily was the first to reach him, her face a mixture of concern and awe. "Are you okay? Your eyes were different." "I'm fine," Jackson managed, though fine seemed wholly inadequate to describe his current state. His mind buzzed with information, and concepts that he somehow understood despite never having studied advanced physics, xenobiology, or quantum mechanics. "I saw everything." Dr. Reyes approached cautiously as systems came back online around them, her professional composure temporarily shaken by what she'd witnessed. "Mr. Miller, can you describe what happened during the interface?" Before Jackson could formulate a response that would make sense to others, the ground beneath them trembled slightly. At first, he thought it might be some after effect of the energy pulse, but then he realized the vibration was coming from the artifact itself, or rather from deep below it. "Everyone move back," Dr. Reyes ordered sharply, her training reasserting itself as she gestured for the research team to retreat to a safer distance. Jackson, however, remained where he was, a strange certainty guiding his actions. "It's okay," he said calmly. "This is supposed to happen. The central node is establishing connections with the other 6 nodes around the planet." "How do you know that?" Dr. Chen asked, scientifically curious despite the potential danger. "I just know," Jackson replied, unable to explain how the information existed in his mind as if he'd always possessed it. The knowledge transfer included operational parameters. The 7 nodes are creating a planetary network that will operate in harmony with Earth's natural electromagnetic field. As he spoke, the ground around the artifact began to shift and reconfigure. Rather than cracking or breaking apart, the soil seemed to flow like liquid, reorganizing into concentric circles that radiated outward from the central disk. Within minutes, the ridge had transformed into a series of terraced rings, each approximately 6 feet wide, extending in perfect circles around the artifact. "Incredible," breathed Dr. Chen, monitoring readings on a device that had survived the electromagnetic pulse. "The molecular structure of the soil itself is being reconfigured at the atomic level. Carbon bonds are reforming, mineral compositions shifting. It's essentially creating optimized growing medium custom-tailored to this specific latitude and climate conditions." Lily, whose environmental science classes had included soil analysis, knelt to examine the transformed earth. "It's like the difference between dead dirt and living soil, but accelerated by centuries," she observed, rubbing the rich, dark material between her fingers. "This is what agricultural scientists try to create through decades of careful management, happening in minutes." The transformation continued to spread outward from the artifact in a steadily expanding circle. When it reached the edge of the ridge and encountered the first of Jackson's struggling fields, the wave of change accelerated, as if the greater need created stronger response. Withered, drought-stressed plants visibly straightened and greened. Before their eyes, their cellular structures rejuvenated by whatever energy the artifact was projecting. Dr. Reyes watched in professional amazement, her scientific mind struggling to categorize what could only be described as technological terraforming happening in real time. "The energy signature matches nothing in our database," she reported after checking a specialized instrument. "It's operating on principles we've theorized but never successfully implemented, quantum entanglement at a macroscopic scale, creating synchronous beneficial changes without displacing existing biological systems. It's working with nature, not against it," Jackson said, echoing his grandfather's words from the letter. The knowledge transfer had given him insight into the underlying principles, even if he lacked the scientific vocabulary to explain them fully. "The Guardians believe that's where we went wrong, trying to dominate natural systems instead of enhancing and cooperating with them." As the visible changes continued to spread across the Miller property, Dr. Reyes received urgent communications through her recovered systems. "The other 6 nodes have activated simultaneously," she reported, a hint of awe breaking through her professional demeanor. Australia, Peru, Egypt, Siberia, Madagascar, and Japan, all showing identical energy signatures and localized environmental transformations. Jackson wasn't surprised by this information. Somehow he'd already known it was happening, as if he could sense the other nodes through some connection established during the knowledge transfer. What did surprise him was the next piece of information Dr. Reyes shared. Satellite imagery confirms that the effect is expanding along ley lines, connecting the 7 nodes, she said, showing him imagery on her recovered tablet. The restoration effect appears to be following Earth's natural electromagnetic pathways, prioritizing areas with the greatest environmental degradation. The implications were staggering. If the transformation continued to spread at its current rate following the planet's natural energy grid, it would eventually create a global network of restored ecosystems, potentially reversing centuries of environmental damage within weeks or months, rather than the decades or centuries conventional science had estimated would be necessary. This is what they intended all along, Jackson realized aloud. Not a sudden intervention, but a carefully planned restoration that would activate only when our own actions had pushed planetary systems to a critical threshold. And your grandfather was part of this plan, Lily added, the pieces falling into place for her as well. That's why the artifact was here, on our farm. They needed people who understood the land, who would preserve both the technology and the knowledge until it was needed. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another government vehicle, this one unmarked but clearly official. From it emerged a man in his 60s, wearing an expensive suit that marked him as someone of significant authority, accompanied by 2 younger assistants carrying briefcases. Director Hammond, Dr. Reyes acknowledged with a respectful nod. I didn't expect you personally on site. The simultaneous activation of all 7 artifacts constitutes an unprecedented situation, Doctor, the man replied, his gaze fixed on the transformed landscape and still expanding circles of rejuvenation. The President has been briefed, and international partners are requesting information-sharing protocols be activated immediately. His attention turned to Jackson. Mr. Miller, I'm Director Alexander Hammond, Special Projects Division, Department of Energy. My department has been monitoring the artifacts since their original discovery. I understand you've undergone direct knowledge transfer as the designated custodian. Jackson nodded, instantly wary of the bureaucratic machinery that was clearly grinding into motion around this situation. That's right. And based on what I now understand, this technology isn't meant to be controlled or contained. It's designed to operate openly, restoring environmental systems across the planet. Hammond's expression revealed nothing of his thoughts on this declaration. That may well be its designed purpose, Mr. Miller. However, the national security implications of technology, this advanced operating autonomously on American soil, and globally, require careful consideration and management. It's not operating autonomously, Jackson corrected him. It's operating in accordance with protocols established by its creators and accepted by my grandfather as custodian, a role that has now passed to me. Something shifted in Hammond's demeanor, or his subtle recalculation of approach. Of course, and we fully respect the historical arrangement your grandfather established. The government has honored that agreement for over 70 years by maintaining the confidentiality of this location and providing protection from interested parties who might have interfered with the artifact before its proper activation. Time. Jackson recognized the oblique reference to corporate interests like Agricor, who would certainly have viewed the artifact's restorative technology as a threat to their industrial agricultural model. It was a reminder that the situation was more complex than simply government versus private citizen rights. There were multiple powerful entities who would have their own agendas regarding this technology. "What exactly are you proposing, Director?" Jackson asked directly. "A partnership," Hammond replied smoothly. "Your family maintains custodial rights as established in the original agreement, while our resources provide the necessary security and scientific support to implement this technology responsibly on a global scale. The knowledge you've received would be treated as proprietary to the Miller family, with implementation rights negotiated on terms advantageous to you and protective of the technology's intended purpose." It was a carefully calibrated offer, acknowledging Jackson's position while attempting to establish government involvement that would inevitably lead to some degree of control. Before Jackson could respond, however, Lily stepped forward. "The knowledge doesn't belong to us," she said firmly. "Great-grandpa's letter was clear. The Guardians intended this technology to benefit Earth and all of humanity. It's not something to be owned or controlled. It's something to be shared." Hammond regarded the teenager with measured respect. "A noble sentiment, Ms. Miller. However, the practical reality of revolutionary technology is that without proper protection and implementation frameworks, it can be misused, suppressed, or exploited. There are powerful interests who would prefer this restoration network never function as intended." As if to underscore his point, the distant sound of helicopters became audible, approaching from the east, from the direction of Agricorps regional headquarters. Dr. Reyes quickly checked her communications panel. "Unscheduled aircraft approaching," she confirmed. 3 helicopters, non-military corporate registrations. They're maintaining legal altitude, but appear to be conducting aerial surveillance." "Agricorps," Jackson concluded grimly. "They must have detected the energy signature too." Hammond nodded. "The activation event was impossible to conceal. We've established temporary restricted airspace, but corporate entities have sophisticated detection systems and considerable political influence. The situation will become increasingly complex over the next 24-48 hours as awareness spreads." Jackson looked out over his farm, where the expanding wave of restoration had now reached nearly half his property. Fields that had been failing for years were visibly regenerating. Soil that had been depleted was darkening with renewed vitality, and even the air seemed somehow cleaner, charged with healthy negative ions that made breathing feel more energizing. What had begun as a desperate attempt to save his family farm had evolved into something far greater, a turning point not just for the Miller legacy, but potentially for humanity's relationship with the planet itself. The responsibility was enormous, perhaps even overwhelming, but Jackson felt a strange sense of readiness that he suspected had been part of his grandfather's legacy all along. "We need time," he said finally, turning back to Hammond. "Time to understand exactly what this technology can do and how best to share it. Not control it, not own it, share it. If your department can help create that space, then yes, we have a partnership. But if you're looking to classify and contain this, then we have a problem." Hammond considered this condition thoughtfully before extending his hand. "I believe we can work within those parameters, Mr. Miller. For now, let's focus on the immediate situation, specifically how to manage the corporate interest that's currently circling your property and will soon be making their own proposals." As they shook hands, the artifact pulsed with renewed intensity, as if responding to the agreement. The battle for control of the Guardian's gift was just beginning, but for the first time in years, Jackson felt something beyond the grinding worry of potential failure, a sense of purpose that connected him not just to his family's past, but to humanity's future. By late afternoon, Miller Farm had become the epicenter of a rapidly escalating situation that transcended any ordinary property dispute. The NASA research team had established a formal operational perimeter extending half a mile in every direction, bolstered by additional security personnel who arrived shortly after Director Hammond. Satellite images, now being carefully controlled in official channels but leaking through various social media accounts, showed the distinctive pattern of restoration spreading outward from the farm in a geometric pattern that followed natural energy pathways through the landscape. Local residents had begun gathering at the roadblocks, drawn by both the unusual activity and the visible changes to vegetation that now extended well beyond the Miller property lines. News vans from regional stations had arrived, their reporters delivering breathless updates about unexplained phenomena and government research activities, while carefully avoiding any mention of extraterrestrial technology. Inside the security perimeter, Jackson stood with Director Hammond and Dr. Reyes at the edge of the ridge, watching as the artifact continued its steady work. The concentric rings surrounding it had evolved further, developing what appeared to be specialized growing zones with distinct soil compositions and moisture levels. "It's creating a demonstration garden," Jackson explained, drawing on knowledge that continued to unfold in his mind like a gradually opening book. Each ring is optimized for different plant species and agricultural approaches. It's a teaching tool. "Fascinating," Dr. Reyes murmured, recording his observations. "The technology doesn't just implement changes. It's designed to educate humans about how to maintain and expand those changes themselves." Hammond nodded thoughtfully, which supports your argument for shared implementation rather than controlled access. A teaching tool is only valuable if people can learn from it. Their discussion was interrupted by a security officer approaching with urgent information. "Director, AgriCorps representatives are at the eastern checkpoint, demanding access. They're claiming proprietary interest in the technology based on mineral rights they've acquired for adjacent properties. They've brought legal counsel and are threatening immediate injunctive relief if denied access." Hammond's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Sooner than expected, they must have had preparations already in place, waiting for something like this. Jackson wasn't surprised. AgriCorps' aggressive expansion throughout the region had always seemed strangely targeted, especially their focused acquisition of properties surrounding his farm. They knew something was here, he concluded. Maybe not exactly what, but enough to make them want to control this land. "Likely," Hammond agreed. "Certain corporate entities have maintained research divisions dedicated to tracking potential breakthrough technologies, particularly those with extraterrestrial origins. The security protocols around the artifacts have been compromised several times over the decades." He turned to the security officer. "Inform the AgriCorps representatives that this site is currently under federal jurisdiction due to national security protocols. All access requests must go through proper channels with appropriate clearances." "They anticipated that response, sir," the officer replied. "They're claiming that their corporate counsel has already secured an emergency hearing with Judge Reynolds in the federal district court. They expect a ruling within the hour, granting them observer status at minimum." The name struck a chord with Jackson. Reynolds. Carlton Reynolds? He was the judge who ruled in favor of AgriCorps in all those water rights cases last year. Hammond nodded grimly. "Corporate interests maintain careful relationships with strategic members of the judiciary. It's an effective tactic that's difficult to counter through conventional channels." For Jackson, this development crystallized the true nature of the conflict unfolding around his family's legacy. This wasn't simply government versus private ownership, but a more complex battle between forces that would preserve the Guardian's gift as intended and those who would seek to control or suppress it for profit. "Let them come," he said suddenly, surprising both Hammond and Dr. Reyes. "Mr. Miller, I strongly advise against direct engagement with AgriCorps representatives at this stage," Hammond cautioned. "Their legal team is specifically trained to extract admissions and declarations that can later be used in court proceedings." "I'm not suggesting we let them take control," Jackson clarified. "I'm suggesting we let them see exactly what's happening. Here, on our terms, not through courtroom maneuverings where they control the narrative. The certainty in his voice came partially from the knowledge transfer, which had included strategic understanding beyond his normal experience. The artifact is already changing the land in ways their industrial agricultural model can't match. Let them witness what they're fighting against. Dr. Reyes studied him with new interest. The knowledge transfer included tactical assessments, didn't it? The Guardians anticipated opposition. Jackson nodded. They've been observing Earth for centuries. They understand human power structures and how entrenched interests resist change. This isn't the first world they've helped through technological transition phases. Hammond considered this revelation carefully before making his decision. We'll allow a limited AgriCorps delegation to enter the perimeter as observers only, accompanied by security and recording personnel at all times. No sampling, no direct interaction with the artifact or transformed areas without explicit authorization. As arrangements were made for the corporate visitors, Lily approached from the direction of the farmhouse, where she'd been documenting the spreading transformation with her phone camera. "Dad, you need to see this," she said urgently, showing him her screen. "It's happening at the Tompkins place too." The video clearly showed the same distinctive patterns of restoration spreading across what had recently become AgriCorps property. Plants were visibly straightening and greening. Soil was darkening with renewed vitality, and even the small creek that ran through the property, nearly dry for 2 years, was now flowing with clear water. The network doesn't recognize property boundaries, Jackson realized. It follows natural energy pathways, regardless of human ownership claims. This observation proved prophetic when, 30 minutes later, the AgriCorps delegation arrived at the research perimeter. The group was led by a sharp-featured woman in her 50s, wearing an impeccably tailored suit that radiated corporate authority. She was accompanied by 2 attorneys carrying briefcases and a man Jackson recognized as AgriCorps' regional operations director. "Mr. Miller," the woman greeted him with practiced cordiality. "I'm Catherine Voss, Executive Vice President of Agricultural Innovation at AgriCorps Industries. We've been neighbors for some time, though we haven't had the pleasure of meeting directly." "Ms. Voss," Jackson acknowledged with deliberate informality. "Interesting timing for your first visit." If his subtle barb registered, she didn't show it. Her attention was already fixed on the artifact and its expanding circles of transformed landscape. "Remarkable technology," she observed. "Our sensors detected the initial energy pulse this morning, though obviously we didn't anticipate anything quite this significant." Jackson noted the careful wording, acknowledgement of monitoring capabilities without admitting prior knowledge of the artifact itself. "Your sensors, strange thing to have pointed at a small family farm. Standard environmental monitoring across our regional holdings," Voss replied smoothly. "Agricultural optimization requires comprehensive data collection." She gestured toward the artifact. "May I ask the origin of this technology? It doesn't appear to match any known terrestrial research program." Before Jackson could respond, Director Hammond stepped forward. "I'm Director Hammond, Department of Energy. The technology's origins and specifications remain classified pending full security assessment. Your presence here is authorized for observational purposes only, with no information disclosure beyond what is visually apparent." Voss smiled thinly. "Of course, Director. AgriCorps respects national security protocols. We're merely interested in potential applications for sustainable agriculture, which is, after all, our company's primary mission." The transparently false claim about AgriCorps' mission, a company notorious for prioritizing yield over sustainability, might have provoked Jackson in the past. Now, informed by the knowledge transfer's deeper understanding, he recognized the tactical maneuvering for what it was. "Ms. Voss," he said calmly, "why don't we walk the property line? I think you'll find the effects particularly interesting where your recently acquired Tompkins farm meets our land." A flicker of something, concern perhaps, crossed her composed features before she nodded agreement. As they walked toward the property boundary, accompanied by Hammond and security personnel, Jackson continued in a conversational tone. "The interesting thing about this technology is how it follows natural energy pathways rather than human-imposed boundaries. It doesn't recognize property lines or corporate holdings, only the land's inherent patterns and needs." They reached the fence line separating Miller Farm from what had been the Tompkins property. The contrast that would normally have been visible between different management approaches had disappeared, replaced by uniform restoration extending seamlessly across both properties. The distinctive geometrical patterns of Agricore's industrial planting were still visible, but the plants themselves had changed, growing more vigorously, developing stronger root systems, and beginning to interact with adjacent species in ways that industrial monoculture typically prevented. "As you can see," Jackson observed, "the restoration network operates independently of human ownership claims. It's already transforming land well beyond our property, including all of Agricore's recent acquisitions in the region." Voss's attorney stepped forward, speaking for the first time. "Any unauthorized technology affecting Agricore property constitutes trespass and potential damage to proprietary agricultural systems. We reserve all rights to seek injunctive relief and damages." "Interesting legal theory," Hammond replied mildly. "However, the effect spreads through naturally occurring electromagnetic pathways that predate any human property claims. No physical trespass has occurred, and the observable effects are universally beneficial to soil health and plant vitality. I'm not aware of any legal precedent for claiming damages from environmental improvement." The attorney began to respond, but Voss silenced him with a subtle gesture. Her attention remained fixed on the transformed landscape, her calculating gaze suggesting rapid reassessment of strategy. "What exactly does this technology do, Mr. Miller?" she asked directly. "Beyond the obvious soil and plant rejuvenation," Jackson considered how much to reveal, guided by both instinct and the strategic understanding from the knowledge transfer. "It restores natural systems to optimal function," he replied carefully. "Soil microbiology, water retention, nutrient cycling, all the processes that industrial agriculture typically disrupts in pursuit of short-term yield maximization. The difference is, these improvements are self-sustaining rather than requiring constant chemical inputs and mechanical intervention." "Fascinating," Voss said, though her tone suggested calculation rather than genuine appreciation. "And who controls the implementation and spread of these effects?" "That's the thing about restoration versus control," Jackson replied. "This technology doesn't seek to dominate natural systems. It enhances them according to their own inherent patterns. The control model that corporations like Agricore have built their business on simply doesn't apply here." Voss's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing the sharp intelligence beneath. "A lovely philosophical position, Mr. Miller, but practical reality suggests that revolutionary technology ultimately aligns with existing power structures, either through partnership or acquisition. Or it disrupts those structures entirely." Lily interjected, joining the conversation. "That's how paradigm shifts work." Voss regarded the teenager with brief surprise before smiling coolly. "Young lady, I've overseen the implementation of 17 major agricultural technology platforms across global markets. Disruption is inevitably followed by consolidation under established institutional frameworks. It's the nature of human systems, but this isn't human technology," Lily countered, "and it wasn't designed to fit into our existing economic models." The simple truth of this statement hung in the air between them. After a moment, Voss turned back to Jackson, her approach. Shifting to direct negotiation. Agricor is prepared to offer comprehensive partnership terms, Mr. Miller. Full retention of your property rights, substantial financial compensation, and a meaningful role in implementation strategies for this technology across our global agricultural network. In exchange, we would acquire exclusive licensing rights for commercial applications, monetizing a gift meant for humanity's collective benefit, Jackson translated. Exactly what the Guardians hoped to prevent. The practical distribution of any technology requires existing infrastructure and market mechanisms, Voss argued. Idealism doesn't scale, Mr. Miller. Implementation does. Before Jackson could respond, a sudden intensification of the artifact's glow drew everyone's attention back to the ridge. The pulsing patterns had accelerated, and new symbols were appearing across its surface, symbols that Jackson somehow understood as a response to the very conversation taking place at the property line. It's listening, he realized aloud. The network is monitoring our discussion about its implementation. As if confirming his statement, a beam of focused light emerged from the artifact, projecting what appeared to be a three-dimensional holographic display approximately 6 feet above its surface. The image showed Earth with 7 illuminated points marking the node locations, connected by lines of energy that were steadily expanding to create a web-like pattern across the planet's surface. It's showing us the network's current status. Dr. Reyes explained, having joined them at the property line. The restoration effect has reached approximately 4.2% of Earth's surface area in just 8 hours, prioritizing regions with critical ecological degradation. The holographic display shifted, showing accelerated projections of the network's expansion over days, weeks, and months, reaching 40% coverage within 30 days, and near-complete planetary integration within 6 months. My God, Hammond breathed. It's a complete planetary restoration system operating entirely independently of human infrastructure or approval. The implications weren't lost on Catherine Voss, whose composed expression had given way to visible concern. The technology unfolding before them didn't require corporate distribution networks, regulatory approvals, or market mechanisms. It operated according to its own parameters, spreading through natural pathways regardless of human ownership boundaries or corporate interests. This changes nothing legally, her attorney declared, though with noticeably less confidence. Unauthorized technological implementation across private property remains actionable under multiple statutes. You're welcome to explain that position to the technology itself, Jackson suggested mildly. It seems to be paying attention to our discussion. As if responding to his statement, the holographic display shifted again, now showing the specific region surrounding Miller Farm. The image zoomed in further, highlighting the recent Agricor acquisitions and their accelerated restoration patterns. Text appeared floating beside the image, not in English or any human language, but symbols that Jackson somehow understood. The renewal cannot be claimed or contained, he translated. It follows patterns established in Earth's formation, which predate human concepts of ownership. For the first time, Catherine Voss appeared genuinely unsettled. The technology they were witnessing operated beyond the framework of corporate acquisition strategies and legal maneuvering that had defined her career. It represented not just a new innovation that could be purchased or controlled, but a fundamental challenge to the entire paradigm of resource exploitation that companies like Agricor were built upon. This conversation isn't over, Mr. Miller, she said finally, her tone revealing the strain beneath her professional veneer. Our legal team will be reviewing all available options. Director Hammond, I assume Agricor's designation as an essential agricultural security partner grants us continued observation rights as this situation develops. All appropriate protocols will be followed, Hammond replied diplomatically, neither confirming nor denying her presumption of privileged access. The AgriCorps delegation retreated toward their vehicles. Jackson turned to Hammond with grim satisfaction. They'll be back with more lawyers, and probably political pressure at levels even you might find challenging. Hammond nodded thoughtfully. Undoubtedly. But they're fighting a battle using outdated weapons. Legal frameworks based on property, rights and resource ownership simply don't apply to a technology that operates through planetary systems rather than human infrastructure. He gestured toward the holographic display still hovering above the artifact. That right there is what they truly fear, a restoration network that functions independently of corporate control mechanisms. It doesn't require their distribution systems, their proprietary inputs, or their ownership models. It renders their entire business approach obsolete. As the sun began to set over Miller Farm, casting long shadows across land that had been transformed in less than a day from struggling to thriving, Jackson felt both the weight and promise of what his grandfather had helped set in motion decades earlier. The confrontation with AgriCorps was merely the first of many challenges that would emerge as the world came to terms with technology that fundamentally altered humanity's relationship with the planet. So what happens next? Lily asked, giving voice to the question hanging in the air. We protect what your great-grandfather entrusted to us, Jackson replied, watching as the day's last light caught the still expanding ripples of restoration spreading across the land. Not by hiding it or controlling it, but by sharing it exactly as the Guardians intended, as a gift for all humanity, not a resource to be exploited. The artifact pulsed in response, as if acknowledging the commitment of its new custodian to the purpose that had been set in motion when a farmer from the stars first made contact with a soldier returning to his land after witnessing the most destructive technology humans had ever created. 3 months after Jackson Miller's plow unearthed, the ancient artifact, the landscape of Oakridge County, had transformed beyond recognition. Where drought-stricken fields had once stretched to the horizon, now flourished a vibrant patchwork of sustainable agriculture systems. The concentric rings surrounding the artifact had evolved into what locals called the Garden of Tomorrow. They were a living demonstration of agricultural approaches that worked in harmony with natural systems rather than against them. The Miller farmhouse, once threatened by foreclosure, now served as the unofficial welcome center for a steady stream of visitors from across the globe. Farmers seeking knowledge, scientists studying the restoration effects, and ordinary citizens witnessing firsthand the profound transformation that had begun with one farmer's desperate gamble on his grandfather's mysterious map. Jackson stood on his porch in the gentle morning light, coffee mug in hand, watching as Lily guided a group of agricultural students through fields that yielded abundantly without chemical fertilizers or intensive irrigation. At 17, she had stepped naturally into the role of educator, her understanding of the restoration technology enhanced by both scientific curiosity and the practical farming knowledge passed down through generations of millers. The network has stabilized at 63% global coverage, reported Dr. Eleanor Reyes, approaching from the research center that had replaced the initial NASA encampment. Environmental metrics continue to improve across all monitored parameters. Carbon sequestration has increased 34% beyond our most optimistic projections. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar truck coming up the farm's long driveway. Dave Tompkins, whose property had been among the first acquired by AgriCorps before the artifact's activation. He parked beside the barn and approached with the easy stride of a man who had spent his life working the land. "Morning, Jackson," he called. "Those heritage wheat varieties you shared are coming up strong. Never seen growth patterns like this? It's like the plants know exactly when to germinate for optimal conditions." They do, Jackson confirmed. The soil microbiome communicates environmental conditions directly to the seed coating. The knowledge transfer included dozens of similar approaches that work with natural intelligence rather than trying to override it. Dave shook his head in lingering amazement. 3 months ago, I was watching corporate drones tear down my family's barn. Now I'm farming again, using methods that make everything I learned in agricultural college seem primitive. He gestured toward the research center. Your NASA friends finally cleared out from my west field, said the monitoring station isn't needed now that the restoration patterns have stabilized. The return of neighboring farms to local ownership had been among the most satisfying developments of the past months. As Agricorp's industrial model proved incompatible with the restoration network's effects, they had begun divesting properties, often returning them to the original farming families at fraction of their acquisition prices. A soft chime from Jackson's phone indicated an incoming communication through the special channel established between the 7 custodians. Unlike conventional calls, these connections operated through the artifacts themselves, creating a secure network independent of human telecommunications infrastructure. The others are gathering, he told Dr. Reyes. Our monthly council meeting. She nodded understanding. I'll make sure you're not disturbed. Inside his grandfather's study, now repurposed as his connection space, Jackson activated the quantum link that united the 7 custodians across vast distances. The familiar presences of his counterparts appeared in his mind, not as visual images, but as distinct cognitive signatures he had come to recognize through their regular communications. Dr. Hiroko Tanaka, from Japan, whose marine restoration work had revitalized fishing stocks thought permanently depleted. Miguel Sanchez from Peru, whose rainforest rejuvenation techniques had become a model for tropical ecology worldwide. Elders Waru and Mali from Australia, who had integrated traditional indigenous knowledge with the Guardian's technology to restore drought-ravaged landscapes. Dr. Fatima Khalid from Egypt, whose desert reclamation projects had created flourishing agricultural zones in previously barren regions. Dr. Nikolai Petrov from Siberia, whose permafrost stabilization efforts had averted catastrophic methane releases, and Damal Mbeki from Madagascar, whose biodiversity preservation work had reversed extinction trends across vulnerable island ecosystems. The final custodianship agreements have been delivered, Dr. Khalid reported to the group. All 7 governments have formally acknowledged our authority over the artifacts and their implementation. A significant reversal from their initial containment attempts, Dr. Petrov noted with a trace of dry humor. Amazing how perspective shifts when the benefits become undeniable. And the United Nations resolution passed unanimously, Amali added. Official recognition of the restoration network as the common heritage of humanity, with protected status under international law. These developments marked the culmination of 3 months of careful navigation between human institutional structures and the Guardian's gift. The initial resistance, legal challenges, military containment attempts, corporate sabotage efforts had gradually given way to acceptance as the restoration effects proved universally beneficial and impossible to control through conventional means. The demonstration gardens have now been established on every continent, Elder Marley reported, each adapted to local conditions but teaching the same fundamental principles of working in harmony with natural systems rather than forcing them into artificial patterns. And the knowledge distribution? Jackson asked, thinking of the carefully calibrated sharing protocols they had established together. Proceeding exactly as planned, Miguel confirmed. The basic principles accessible to anyone, the intermediate knowledge available to those who demonstrate compatible intentions, and the advanced implementations protected until humanity demonstrates readiness. Deeper message behind the Guardian's gift had remained partially obscured, encoded in symbols that had resisted complete translation despite 3 months of intensive analysis. Inside the research center, Dr. Reyes stood before a holographic display, showing the intricate pattern of symbols from the artifact's core. The breakthrough came when we stopped treating it as language and recognized it as a multidimensional cognitive map, she explained. It's not just telling us something, it's showing us how to perceive something. The Guardian's perspective, Jackson realized. Exactly, Dr. Reyes confirmed. Their perception of Earth, humanity, and our potential future. She activated the translation matrix, converting the alien symbols into an approximation of human language. We have watched your kind since your earliest emergence, recognizing the rare spark that exists in few species across the cosmos, the capacity to either create or destroy your own future. This crossroads has been reached by others before you, this moment when technological capability outpaces wisdom, when power over nature exceeds understanding of its patterns. The path you have followed leads toward diminishment of your planet's living systems, of your potential as conscious beings, of the unique beauty your world manifests in the cosmic tapestry. We offer not salvation, but restoration. The opportunity to rejoin the natural patterns from which you have temporarily separated yourselves. This gift awakens at the moment of greatest need, when old patterns can no longer sustain your world. The choice of what follows remains yours, as it must. We offer tools, not direction, potential, not prescription. The future emerging from this restoration will be created by your hands, not ours. Remember this above all. You were never meant to stand apart from the world that created you, but to stand within it as conscious participants in its ongoing creation. The separation was illusion. The reconnection is choice. We will return when you are ready for the next exchange between our kinds. Until then, the stars watch with interest as your world remembers its wholeness. Silence followed the translation, the simple profundity of the message settling over those present like gentle rain on parched soil. After decades of science fiction imagining alien contact as conquest, cooperation, or catastrophe, the reality had proven both simpler and more profound. Patient guardians offering tools for self-restoration at the moment humanity most needed them. They're letting us find our own way, Lily observed quietly, just giving us a course correction when we needed it most. Jackson nodded, thinking of his grandfather, a young soldier returning from witnessing humanity's most destructive technology, chosen by beings from another world to preserve a different kind of power until it was needed most. What had Harold Miller seen in those visitors that had earned such trust? What had they seen in him? "Dr. Reyes," he asked, "have your teams determined how long the artifacts were waiting? When were they actually placed here?" She consulted her data before responding. Based on molecular dating of the surrounding soil integration, approximately 12,000 years ago, coinciding with the beginning of human agriculture. She looked up with sudden understanding. They placed them at the start of our deliberate modification of natural systems, knowing we might eventually need to find balance again. That evening, as sunset painted Oakridge County in gold and amber light, Jackson stood at the edge of his farm, overlooking fields that now thrived without the chemical interventions and mechanical domination that had defined modern agriculture. Throughout the property, other farmers walked in small groups, observing and learning from the demonstration gardens, taking knowledge back to their own lands. The artifact still glowed softly at the center of its concentric rings, but its light had stabilized into a steady, pulsing rhythm that matched Earth's natural electromagnetic frequencies. The initial dramatic transformation had given way to something more subtle but equally profound, a new equilibrium between human activity and natural systems. Lily joined him, carrying a small container of soil from the innermost ring. "I've been thinking about Great-Grandpa's journal," she said. "All those astronomical calculations and strange symbols. He was preparing for this moment his entire life, even though he knew he wouldn't live to see it." "He understood stewardship," Jackson replied, "taking care of something not for personal benefit, but because it matters for everyone who comes after you." Together, they looked out over land that had been in their family for generations. Land that would now continue to flourish long after them, part of a planet finding its way back to balance with the help of visitors who had watched humanity's development with patient concern. The ancient artifact, hidden beneath a struggling farmer's field until the moment of greatest need, had delivered not just environmental restoration, but something humanity had been gradually losing as it separated itself from natural systems: a sense of belonging within rather than dominion over the world that created and sustained human existence. From a desperate attempt to save his family farm, Jackson Miller had become part of something that would reshape humanity's relationship with Earth for generations to come. What had begun with a farmer's plow striking something unexpected beneath his field would continue as a new understanding of what it meant to be proper stewards of the only planet known to harbor the miracle of conscious life. And somewhere among the stars, the Guardians continued their patient watch, waiting for the day when humanity would be ready for the next exchange between their kinds.